So back to our main activity here. Let's go ahead and put together our JSON object request. So as our documentation tells us here, we have a little lesson here. We're going to create a JSON object request because we know we want to go and request this JSON object here, right? Because we said HTTP and we say to-dos, but we say /1, meaning we just want to go ahead and get, in this case, just one object here. Okay, so that's why it's going to be JSON object request. To do that, I'm going to come inside of main, of course, and I'm going to just create a JSON object request. You can do that by just say JSON, and you can see there it is, JSON object request. This is working. Why? Because we're able to add the library in our Gradle like we did before. Okay, so hit enter, and I'm going to call this just request or JSON object request. It's that. I'm going to instantiate it. I'm going to say equals to new JSON object request. Now we have to pass something inside of our JSON object request. The first thing we need to pass is what kind of request am I asking? Okay, because there are different kind of requests when it comes to HTTP networking, right? The main one we're going to look at here is the get. Why? Because we want to get something from our API. So to do that, we're going to invoke the request class like that, dot method interface dot get. You see that? There's get, delete, deprecated, get or post. There's head, options, package, all sort of different kinds, but we are interested in get first. Okay? And then another thing we need to pass here is the actual URL. Okay, where is it we're going to get this information from? What API we're using? Where is it? So I'm going to put a string here, and I'm going to copy what I already have. Okay, and put it there. Very good. And we're going to continue. The next thing we're going to do here is called just a JSON request. In this case here, I'm just going to say null for now. Okay. And then the last one we need to pass here is going to be the actual response. So I'm going to pass the object response. All of this actually comes with the JSON object request. So I'm going to say new response listener. Now, here's the good thing. This response, you see here, it says response.listener. So notice it has an interface here, the listener, which will allow us to then override a few methods that would either allow us to get the actual information on the callback and or when things don't go right. So if you just hit enter like that, you're going to see all of this gibberish here. And we've got a lot of issues, but I'm going to solve it right now. We solve this by right now because somehow we need to always come down here, put a comma, and I'm going to pass something else here, which is going to be when things don't go right. So I'm going to pass another one, say new response error listener like that. And of course, because this is just one line really of code, we have to put there semicolon. Ooh, there's a lot of things here, but not really. So what are we doing here? When we create our JSON object request, we say instantiate that request, and we have to pass a few parameters for our JSON object request. Okay, the first parameter is going to be the get. We want to establish what is it that we're trying to do. Well, we want to get something from an API. Then we pass in our JSON placeholder URL. Okay, because we say, well, we want to get information from this endpoint API. JSON request, we just pass null for now because we don't need to worry about that. And then last but not least, we have to pass the actual listener because we want to make sure that, okay, once this JSON object request goes to our URL, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to return a response. That response has to be captured inside of our listener here, right? It's an interface, you can see, because we are able also to override the on response, right? When things are received from our JSON placeholder here, it's going to be all going to be inside of our response JSON object type. So this JSON object here is going to be what? It's going to be all of this payload that we're getting. All right. All of that was done for us. All we had to do was instantiate and then override on response. But also we have to pass, as you saw, the response error listener here, which we override on error response. So if something happens, then we can fetch the error from volley error class type, and then we can display here. So that way we as developers can know that something is wrong and know exactly what's happening and then tell the user what's going on and so forth. All right. Very good. So now we have our response, our JSON that we got in this form here, which is going to be a JSON object type, which is exactly what we want, because now we're going to be able to traverse through be able to say if it's JSON, we can say this object dot user ID and get 1. That ID, we're going to get 1. That title, get all of this. Completed, false. Because it is an object. Most importantly, it is a JSON object. So it's going to be just like any kind of object. Like we created classes and object with properties, that is the same thing now. This will be a field or property. So if we access this, it's going to give us this. Good. So let's come down here and just say log D like that. I'm going to say response, the whole response. For now here, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to put something like JSON like this. Okay, very good. Now you would think that this is all we needed to do in order for this to work, but it's not. Well, the reason why is because yes, we have our JSON request, but the thing here now is that we have to put that on queue. Remember, when we are trying to access anything online, there's got to be a protocol. There's got to be some sort of a process, because you can't just randomly go get stuff. You meaning the Android system in this case, right? So the idea here with Volley is that everything is put inside of a queue. That way there aren't any traffic jams, or if there are traffic jams, all of the members inside of this queue, they will know when and how to proceed when it's time for them to proceed. Does it make sense? So that is the beauty of using Volley or any other HTTP request library out there, because it abstracts out all of this stuff that we should know if we had to do it all ourselves. Okay, because these fetching data in our application here, there's a lot of things happening. First of all, right? If you have an application running in the background, there is processes happening in the OS or in the operating system level. There's all sort of things happening. There's the user interface that's happening. There's a lot of things happening. So how do we control all of that so that we don't end up with a very bad mess, especially when we're trying to get stuff outside of our application? And on top of that, imagine if you're trying to get something from any API, what would happen if all of a sudden everything you're trying to do is actually bugging down the UI thread, meaning everything that's happening as user is using things on your application. That means your UI would be very, very laggy, so it's going to fall behind and the user will get frustrated. And folks, that is not a good picture. Hence, Volley library comes to rescue, because we don't have to worry about that, but yet we have to make sure that we call our enqueue so that we put our JSON request here inside of a queue, so that way the process happens accordingly and knows exactly when its turn comes. All right, so how do we do all of this thing that I've been telling you about right now? Well, the first thing we're going to do at the top here, I'm going to say a private, call this request. Look at this, all these classes that we have access to because we're using Volley. So it's going to be request queue like that. Call this request queue. Okay, so creating an instance variable so we can use anywhere we want. And what I'm going to do here inside of our main, just at the top here, I am going to then invoke the request Volley new. And then I'm going to invoke the new request queue, because each time we have our request, we need to invoke it, make it so that there is indeed in memory a request queue that is in place so that we can then use this request JSON object onto that request queue. So to do that, I'm going to instantiate request queue that we created here is equal to, I'm going to just go ahead and create called volley dot new request queue. And this new request queue here needs to know where it is supposed to be, right? So meaning we have to pass the context. Well, what is the context? Remember, it's this. Or I could say main.this, doesn't matter. At this point, I can just pass this semicolon there, and we have now a request queue, which can now be used to enqueue our JSON request here so that the system knows, okay, it is time to then go queue things up and go fetch data and do all the things that we don't have to know about. All right. Very good. So as you can see, we haven't used our JSON object here or JSON object request because we hadn't had the chance to put together our request queue. So now that we have that our request queue, it's time for us to get things to work. So where do we call then our request queue and add it to our queue? Well, we come down here. In fact, this is where we're ending our request queue because we put our request queue here. So what we're going to do now is at the end here, make sure it's at the end of our request JSON object request here. And I'm going to go ahead and call our request queue. Say request queue. I'm going to say dot, and then I can add to request to our queue. So what I'm going to add, our JSON object request. That's it. Now, if you save this, we're going to be able to see something hopefully, because once we save this and give it a run, we're going to be able to see something from our onResponse void method here. Okay, let's go ahead and see what's going to happen. Sure, I'm going to run that. Let's go to our logcat. It's taking a little bit. There we go. So it's running. There's our hello world. Not very interesting there. And here we're going to change this to debug because we said log.debug there. And let's make sure we are using that emulator, parsing, that's it. And I want the JSON. What's going on? Nothing. Let's go to run. So we ran and nothing is happening. So we don't see any debug. We don't see anything. What's going on? Let's go to our run. Everything looks great, but we don't see anything happening. Let's see if there's an error. I'm going to say log D. And I'm going to see error because it's an object at this point or type. I'm going to just say get message like that. And of course, I'm going to just put here a tag that says error. Let's save and see what else is going on here. Run again. Well, nothing is really helpful, is it? So we don't see anything. Logcat, there's really nothing happening there. And so we're kind of out of luck. But luckily, I know exactly what's happening here. What's happening is that, okay, we are able to set up everything for volley, everything is good. However, if you remember when we talked about we said that in the manifest file, there's all sort of things we can do that will govern the way our application works, one of which is the permissions. Right, anytime that we want to tap into any internet connection situation, we must make sure that we put that uses permission of internet in our application XML because that is part of the Android security system. So if we come down here in our project here, go to manifest, double click, we must put here that we want the permission to use the internet. In fact, if you have been reading things here, come down here, look at this. To use Volley, you must add Android internet permission to your app's manifest. Without this, your app won't be able to connect to the network. There we go. Right? Small things, but yet very important. So in this case here, I'm going to come down here, open, say users permission, click that, and I want Android permission internet there. So hit enter, and I'm just going to go ahead and close like that. In fact, I can just close myself like this. Okay, so I'm going to save, run, and see what's going to happen. Let's see our logcat, and voila, we can see response, user ID 1, title delectus autem. I think that's how you say it in Latin, and completed false. All right, which is exactly what we saw, we're hoping to see at least here, right? So this is what we are getting because we said we want 1 to-dos. Very good. So there we go, folks. So we were able to get the response JSON in our application here. Okay, so very good. So the next thing I want you to do is how to do the JSON array request. Okay, remember, for that to work, you would actually have to come down here and get rid of that one. In fact, you'll have to come here. Instead of having to-dos to 1, you just get rid of all of that. You just set at to-dos, or you can just come down to the actual API and just click on to-dos. Doesn't matter which one you use, but since we're talking about to-dos, and just go straight to to-dos like that. Copy this and come down here and change that URL. And of course, you will have to create a new one because this is JSON object request. This, in this case, is going to be a JSON array request. And see, follow the same thing we did here, just like what we did here, and see if you can show the whole response array in your log here. Now, the other thing also, if by any chance you don't see anything and you've done everything right, what I would do is restart your Android Studio, because I usually leave my Android Studio running for days and so forth, and sometimes there's some glitches that happen there, okay? So whenever things are not quite working as you would want them to work, if you know exactly that everything is great, and if you notice that you've had your Android Studio running for a few days or so, just restart it and try it again. Sometimes that happens and you should see the response showing there. Okay, very good. I'll see you in the next video.